Along the coast of France, ruined bunkers remind us of a terrible war that once cast a shadow across the world. But the ruins here are not the only shadows left behind by battle.
This is Calais Canadian War Cemetery. After the victory in Normandy, the Allies thought that the war in Europe was essentially over, but the Germans were far from beaten. This is the grave of Major Peter Kennedy, Highland Light Infantry of Canada. He was killed at Boulogne, 17 September 1944, and he's buried beside his brother Douglas, who was killed 2 days later. In the final 8 months of the war, 10,000 Canadians would die for king and country.
In August 1944, the Allied armies surround and destroy the German armies in France. And with the Germans everywhere on the run, the Allies race forward, liberating town after town. And it seems as if it will be a short road to victory. Summer 1944. In their victorious headlong advance, the only way the Allies can get supplies, food, ammunition, and gasoline, is through the narrow bottleneck of the Normandy beachhead. And as their supply lines stretch to the breaking point, this threatens to strangle the Allied offensive. So the Allies must capture the Channel ports, and the Canadians are ordered to take them, attacking along the Atlantic coast, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk. With the Canadians, as they swing into action against Boulogne, is Artillery Commander Brigadier General Stanley Todd.
We had very large enemy forces bottled up in both Boulogne and Calais. Boulogne was a very strongly prepared and defended position. They were in something like 20 feet of cement with steel domes to them, and every other ruddy thing. The 25-pounder shells would bounce off those fortifications like peas off a tin pan. We tried to get the engineers and infantry onto the roof of one place under cover of smoke. And they poured gasoline down the air ventilators and set fire to them and burned the Germans out.
After 9 days fighting, Boulogne falls. But the Germans have blown up the docks, rendering them useless. And the Canadians race north towards Calais.
This is Fort de la Crèche. It was an important piece of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and it has a commanding position over Boulogne to the south and Wimereux to the north. It was considered so strong that an airstrike was ordered just to eliminate it. On September 22nd, the same day Boulogne fell, the Queen Zone of Toronto actually captured this position. The next job for the Canadians was to clean up Hitler's Atlantic Wall and capture Calais.
Immediately, the Canadians swing into attack against Calais and the giant German gun emplacements defending it at Cap Grinet, known as Battery Todd.
This is one of the gun casements of Battery Todd. This giant bunker, and there were 4 of them, housed the gun with a barrel width of 380 millimeters that could fire a 2,000-pound shell 25 miles. These things are absolutely enormous and incredibly impressive, and that's without the gun. You can actually see where the pivot is and where the track would have run around here. And of course, they'd be firing a shell about that big towards England, which is less than 20 miles away.
For 4 years, German shells have poured down on southern England, particularly on Dover, causing thousands of casualties. Now the Canadians rush to silence the German guns.
Batteries such as these had their own defenses. They often had anti-tank ditches around them. They had minefields protecting them, machine gun pillboxes. So only a really coordinated attack would have any success. And of course, that's exactly what happened. On September 29th, 1944, in the early morning, the North Novas, assisted by tanks, got through the minefields, surprised the German garrison, and were quickly at the encasements. You can actually see some of the damage of their attack over here, but of course you couldn't get through the cement. So the men ran around and started chucking grenades into slats like this, and of course the tanks were still firing on the other side, and there's some really interesting damage over here.
After 2 days of bitter fighting, one German garrison has had enough. Inspecting a conquered bunker with the North Shore Regiment is the chaplain, Father R. Miles Hickey.
That very afternoon, Captain Ross, Major Carson, Captain Noel Humphreys, Sergeant Major McRae, and Corporal Parker went by jeep to see one of the big Berthas. As they approached the place, their jeep hit a mine. They all, excepting Captain Ross, were killed instantly. In a few hours, tragedy stole all satisfaction from our victory.
This is Calais Canadian War Cemetery, and it contains the graves of 600 Canadians, mostly men killed liberating the Channel ports. This plot contains a number of men from the North Shore Regiment from New Brunswick. This is the grave of Major J.M. Carson, and beside him is Lance Corporal R.L. Parker. They were both killed when their jeep hit a mine. 2 other men were killed at the same time, Captain Humphreys and the Regimental Sergeant Major McRae. The Germans used mines extensively throughout the Second World War, and they killed hundreds of the Canadians this way.
Calais finally falls, but like the other Channel ports, it has been systematically demolished by the Germans. The Allies still do not have a port, and the Canadians are now ordered north to open the biggest port of them all, Antwerp. September 1944. Allied tanks roll into Antwerp and quickly liberate the great Belgian city. Antwerp's port, one of the largest in Europe, has not been destroyed by the Germans, but it is useless to the Allies. Antwerp lies on the River Scheldt, 80 kilometers from the sea, and both shores of the Scheldt are held by the Germans. The job of clearing the Germans from the Scheldt goes to the Canadians. Their plan is to attack north and south of the river. To the south, they will assault the German-held area known as the Breskens Pocket. Hundreds of square kilometers of flat, muddy, flooded farmland.
This is the Leopold Canal, and it was right here that the Canadians made their first attempt to break into the Breskins pocket on October 6, 1944. The Canadians knew that the German defenses were strong, so they brought up a special weapon, the Wasp, to help with the assault. The Wasps were tracked flamethrowers, and they actually brought them up across these fields, lined them all up for about a mile, and of course then the Wasps blew the Germans out of their positions. Of course, against bunkers like this, flamethrowers were extremely effective. After they drove the early German defenders away, the Canadian infantry crossed the canal.
Getting the troops across the canal is the North Nova Scotia Regiment's Major Otte Corbett.
The crossing came under heavy mortar and artillery fire. Our casualties were growing, but we were able to keep 2 boats going most of the time. And by late afternoon, the Regina Rifles committed all their companies and held a piece of real estate on the far side of the canal. They had a toehold, but could not improve it. The entire battalion had only gained 200 yards, and the Jerrys were counterattacking.
Going into the fight on the far side of the canal is the Regina Rifles' Lieutenant Kenneth Bergen.
I ordered an advance and led the platoon over the top of the embankment. But enemy fire was so heavy that those not killed or wounded had to reverse their attack and regroup. Everything had suddenly become quiet, leading me to believe that we had lost our entire company.
With their troops still fighting desperately on the Leopold Canal, the Canadians launched the second part of their bold plan: to secretly sail down the River Scheldt, right under the big German coastal guns and past German defenses. And on the beaches behind German lines, land 2,000 troops.
This beach is the northern flank of the Breskins pocket. You can see the Scheldt here, and to the north, barely visible, is South Beveland and the Walcheren over there. They were in German hands in 1944. The Canadian plan was to make an amphibious assault coming over this area and landing on these beaches and basically coming in the back door. The problem was, if the Germans found them or saw them, their heavy guns at the Walcheren could blow them out of the water in no time. At 2 a.m. on October 9th, 1944, the Canadians of the Highland Light Infantry of Canada landed on these beaches unopposed. It appeared they had caught the Germans completely by surprise.
For days, from dike to dike, from flooded field to flooded field, the Canadians fight their way, often waist deep in mud and water. They quickly earn their new nickname, the Water Rats.
This dike is typical of hundreds of dikes that Canadian soldiers would have walked on in 1944. This one still has the cobblestone road. Of course, in 1944, the cobbles could well be mined, as could the shoulders of the dikes. And if also the polders over here are going to be flooded. So the only approach to this farmhouse would be along the dike. And this is how the Canadian troops would approach all the farmhouses in this polder region. Of course, they didn't have any idea who was going to be in there, so every farmhouse was its own challenge. But if a patrol is going up, single file, and the lead man would be the bravest because he's the guy most likely to get shot, they'd approach it, and once the Germans opened fire, the men would scramble to the side of the dike to look for any cover they could get.